you're a reader, you can probably relate to the fantasy of finding a magical hidden gem book that nobody else is talking about, but everybody will be soon. In the spirit of pride, I was on a mission to uncover some incredible LGBTQIA+ books that deserve more attention than they're getting. And of the 13 books I started this month, 11 of them fit the theme. But unfortunately, none of them lived up to my expectations. Not one 5-star read. Just because they didn't knock my striped stockings off, that doesn't mean they're not worth discussing. We all have different tastes, right? And maybe my reading misadventures will help lead you to your next favorite read. Let's get into it. The first book I read this month is Feast While You Can by Michaela Clements and Anjali Datta. Published in 2024, it's a queer romance horror hybrid, and it's set in a small Italian mountain town in the 1990s. The book follows Angelina. Angelina's a small town homebody. She wants nothing more from life than to be surrounded by her close-knit extended family, work as a bartender, and have the occasional girl-on-girl hookup. But her life is disrupted when her brother's ex-girlfriend, the woman responsible for her own sexual awakening, Jagvi, returns to town. The two of them have a really complicated history, and Angelina cannot wait for Jagvi to leave again. But she changes her tune when an ancient cave monster wakes up and begins stalking her. As its power over her strengthens, it becomes apparent that only Jagvi can keep its lust for possession at bay. But can they work together to save Angelina, or will the monster devour both of their futures once and for all? Now, obviously I liked the premise. Lurking ancient evils are one of my favorite horror tropes. From the beginning of this book, there was a mismatch. Early on, there's a scene where everybody's gathered in the cave where the legendary monster supposedly lives, and they're daring each other to get closer, and they're swapping scary stories. I'm about to say something so mean, but as I was reading this scene, I said to myself, what YA nonsense is this? And I actually opened Amazon to double check that I hadn't accidentally picked a YA book because the dialogue and the whole setup felt so juvenile to me. Nothing against YA if that's your thing, but I barely liked reading YA even when I was YA. At 10 years old, I was reading wildly age-inappropriate books. That's a different story. I want my horror to go places that YA doesn't or can't. But I found no evidence that this was intended for younger audiences, so I did keep reading. It's just we didn't get off to a good start. Then almost immediately, the book enters adult territory. I might be misremembering this, but I'm pretty sure right after everybody visits the cave, Angelina goes home alone. She's in bed. She has a nightmare. She wakes up and immediately takes care of herself. I found this weird. That's not my preferred way to deal with nightmares, but to each their own. Anyway, from then on, the book had a lot of spice. A lot. And the spice is graphic. So I'd even say the book is like half horror and half spicy romance. It said horror romance hybrid, but I just did not know what I was in for. If you're looking for a book with explicit lesbian spice scenes, look no further, this is the one. Now the horror, it does get much darker than I expected it to from the beginning. The monster is not kidding around, and the possession scenes are intense. But I think that horror would have hit harder for me if, 1, there was less backstory about the human characters, less graphic spice interrupting the horror constantly, and 2, more backstory about this monster. There are so many flashback scenes in this book for the human characters, and almost none for the monster. I don't care about your high school yearnings, Angelina. I want to understand how the monster got there and why it's set on eating your future. The supernatural elements were just frustratingly vague. Okay, I don't usually do this, but before I keep talking about this book, I feel compelled to give you one content warning, and this is probably just because it's the only one I really care about, or the one I care about the most. So please skip ahead if you don't want to hear any spoilers. A dog suffers in the making of this book. It's bad. If you're sensitive to that, please don't read it. You'll be very upset. I was upset. And I didn't even think it was necessary for the story either. Kill all the people you want. Leave the pets alone. So I probably gave this book one less star than I would have on that fact alone. But overall, I wanted more information about the monster. I personally wanted less graphic spice, sorry. I liked the tension between Angelina and Jagby. I loved the ending. I thought the ending of this book was excellent. The book as a whole felt uneven. If you like graphic, spicy queer romance mixed in with your horror, if you like really developed human characters, you want to know their whole backstory, but you don't need the monster's biography to find it scary, maybe give this one a try. A lot of people are giving it really positive reviews. Just didn't do it for me. It just wasn't for me. After I finished, I read Hugh Ryan's review of this book in the New York Times, and he had a completely different interpretation than I did, which I thought was really interesting and worth talking about. So Hugh reads the monster as a metaphor for the pervasive homophobia of the 1990s. Just like homophobia, the monster's a force that limits queer people's choices, it restricts their movement, it steals their memory, and ultimately, it devours their futures. I do think there's something to this interpretation. However, I'm going to point out that before the monster was bothering Angelina and Jagby, it previously bothered Angelina's ancestors. And in the book, they weren't characterized as queer in any way. So I don't think it's right that it exists to only limit queer people's choices. I do think it's an interesting read. I'm just not sure it's the right one. Also, Hugh does go on to say in his review that explicit themes of homophobia and racism are touched on, but maybe not explored deeply enough in the novel. And I do agree with that. But the observation from his review that stopped me in my tracks came in the last paragraph. Hugh wrote that in the book, quote, "Queer desire is the cure, not the curse." That I love. Horror as a genre has a long history of demonizing homosexuality, but this book sets it up so that the only hope the main characters have of overcoming the threat of this monster is through expressing their gay love. That's a pretty remarkable flip. And I do agree with that interpretation. I think it's the best thing about the story. It's just a bummer that I got those takeaways by reading the review instead of through my actual reading of the book. So while I do think in some ways this is a groundbreaking book, I do understand why other people liked it. My personal experience reading through it was frustrating. It was kind of a slog, so I only gave it 2 stars. Even though I wasn't wowed by Feast While You Can, I was still set on reading as much LGBTQIA+ literature as I could for Pride Month. Fortunately, the next 2 novels I picked out were even less to my taste, and I quickly abandoned them both. So my first DNF did not finish, of June, was What Grows in the Dark by Jack Evans. What Grows in the Dark is described as a sapphic supernatural horror thriller about dark family secrets and betrayal. When the book begins, we meet Bridget. She's a broke paranormal investigator, hoping to one day have her own Ghost Adventures type show. While her clients believe that Bridget is a spirit medium channeling her deceased sister to help restless ghosts move into the beyond, we quickly learn that Bridget's a fraud. Anything paranormal that seems to happen when she's around is just a stunt. Now, when Bridget gets a phone call from one of her sister's friends offering her a lot of money to return to her hometown and help investigate a missing persons case, Bridget reluctantly accepts. Turns out that the missing persons case shares eerie similarities to the circumstances that led to her sister's death. Bridget starts to fear there's something much bigger at play. Something monstrous. Unfortunately, I grew bored with this book very quickly. For one thing, I am sick to death of the fake medium trope. I don't know where this story was going, but most of the time in the stories about fake mediums, the fake ghost hunters, they learn the ghosts were real all along. Ooh. Yeah. I also found this writing confusing and frankly immature again. I didn't find it believable. Why would Bridget be included in the investigation that sets the story in motion? Maybe she'd be questioned, sure, over the phone, but I don't buy that a police officer would pay her to come home and give her such an important role. It made no sense. I got to 21% through this book. I had zero interest in what happened next, so I decided to cut my losses and find something else to read. The next book I picked up was Something's Wrong with Maddie by Taylor Z. Adams. And I was actually really excited for Something's Wrong with Maddie because of the cover. I know that's not a great reason, but I'm obsessed with the femme ghosty, bloody title on a baby pink background. It's so cute, and it's got to be one of my favorite covers I've seen all year. Too bad I didn't like the contents of the book at all. I didn't like them. Described as a sapphic horror novel, Something's Wrong with Maddie tells the story of Piper. Piper's a grief-stricken woman mourning the shocking accidental death of her girlfriend, Maddie. Piper's so desperate to get Maddie back that she performs an elaborate blood ritual to reanimate her, as you do. And against all odds, the ritual works. I mean, sort of. Something gurgling, broken, and twitchy shows up in Piper's apartment in a zombie form that can only be her beloved. Now, this had the potential to be a refreshing spin on a zombie story. Piper's love for Maddie seemed genuine, even kind of profound, and the book is only 258 pages, so I could have easily finished it in one afternoon. But I could not get on with the writing style at all. I mean, at all, because the sentences were mostly very short. For example, and I grabbed this randomly. When the zombie arrives, the text reads, quote, "The noise scraped out again, raw and struggling. It was close. Inside. My stomach turned. My heartbeat accelerated rapidly." The text continues on and on like that. To illustrate my point, I flipped ahead a few random pages. I grabbed another quote. "It spasmed. A pulse, then another. With each motion, a dull crack. Something was setting, locking into place." It was just page after page of these fleeting, tiny sentences, and it was driving me up the wall. I mean, my blood pressure was rising. So I had to give Something's Wrong with Maddie up, and I was only 27% through. I had to. It was bad for my health. Based on the publisher's description, I think if I'd continued the book, that Maddie would have started eating their neighbors, but not even the promise of a feasting zombie could get me to read another 200 pages of 1 to 3 word sentences. Right and complete sentences. This one made me so crazy. Okay, at this point, I was nervous because so far in June, I'd finished one book that was okay, and then I'd given up on 2 books in a row that sounded like they'd be perfect for me. I was starting to fear the dreaded slump. And my solution in this case was just to completely scrap my planned reading list because obviously my judgment couldn't be trusted. And I decided to pick something from the Skip the Line list that's available on the Libby app. Just FYI, these are loans the library provides of in-demand ebooks. They're often newer releases and they have long wait lists. You only get to borrow Skip the Line books for 1 week, but no waiting. And I don't know why, but I've been having better luck with these impulsive picks lately than I've been having with the books I've been highly anticipating. Things like Feast While You Can or Something's Wrong with Maddie that I had on hold for weeks and really let me down. And maybe this is just working because there's no buildup. I don't have any expectations, so I don't get disappointed. I don't know. But the Skip the Line book I picked was Whidbey by T. Kyra Madden. And I went into Whidbey almost blind. It tells the story of 3 women whose lives are all connected to the same abusive man, a man named Calvin. When the novel opens, a queer woman named Birdie is taking a ferry to an island off the coast of Washington State called Whidbey Island. And she meets a man on the ferry who asks her about her trip. She explains she's hiding from her abuser because he was recently released from prison in Florida. The stranger's response is chilling. He actually offers to kill Calvin for her, and he even explains how he would do it in great detail. She need only ask. And he doesn't believe that she will, but she does. So they exit the ferry, and they never see each other again. But a short time later, Calvin's found murdered. Now, did the stranger on the ferry come through for Birdie? Was it somebody else connected to her? Or maybe another girl he hurt, or even one of his own relatives? That's the central mystery that drives the novel. When I picked it up, I thought it was going to be a straightforward murder mystery. And a small part of it is, but much more of this book is a character study of people shaped by trauma. So I would classify this book as literary fiction, not mystery or thriller. It's really about the aftermath of abuse, how it ripples through survivors, families, and the justice system, and then who gets to control the narrative. And this was so well done. The 3 main female characters felt real, and I loved how my opinion of them kept shifting as we learned new information throughout the book. I especially appreciated one of the narrators is the abuser's mother, because that's a perspective that we rarely see, and it adds a lot of moral complexity about who deserves our compassion. So the one thing that I did have trouble with is that about 2/3 of the way through the book, it switches. So the narrator stops being one of the three women, and then instead there's an omniscient narrator who comes in just out of nowhere and wraps up the whole story. I actually loved the conclusion, but that switch in perspective was so jarring that I didn't enjoy the end of the book as much as I could have. Now, if you like rich character studies that wrestle with dark and morally complex themes, and you're okay with a slower paced book, I would highly recommend Whidbey. I gave it 4 stars, and I am looking forward to reading whatever T. Kyra Madden writes next. After Whidbey, I thought, I'm back on track. Unfortunately, things were about to go right off the rails because the next book I picked up was Carnalis by Tiffany Morris. Carnalis tells the story of a hedonistic socialite named Lauren. Lauren has a run-of-the-mill drug problem, and let's just say special dietary needs that she keeps hidden from her innocent girlfriend, Alex. Alex is actually a recently injured professional dancer who fears she may never regain her strength. And until she does, she's helpless and financially dependent on Lauren. And she's coming to realize that whatever it is Lauren's up to may not be just unsavory. It may cost her her life. I found this book on Libby, and I didn't realize when I checked it out, it's only 155 pages. So I might have passed on it if I knew it was so short, because historically, I'm not a fan of novellas or short stories. Just generally speaking, they don't build out the characters in the world enough for me to be as invested as I like. If an author puts too many ideas, characters, or themes into a novella, it leaves me wanting more, but in a bad way. And then I'm just mad. Carnalis made me mad. The story, it kept introducing a place or characters, and it seemed to be building to something really sinister. It would almost be so cool, only to yank you out of that plotline and then stick you in a new one. Just so whiplash I had. This is a book about class, consumerism, entitlement, an indigenous population in Canada, sexuality, and yes, cannibalism. And in trying to address all of these themes, I don't think it goes deeply enough into any of them. Early in the book, we learn that this is a world where cannibals can buy ethically sourced meat. Human beings whose lives are especially bleak can volunteer to shorten their lifespan and become part of the food supply. And in exchange, they get short-term comforts they would never otherwise be able to enjoy. That's pretty interesting. Imagine you could spend your final days in unparalleled luxury. What would it take to make you strike that bargain? Is there such a thing as ethical meat? These are great questions to explore, and I would have loved to read a book that stayed in that theme and expressed a viewpoint on some of those questions. In my opinion, the book fails to deliver on this creative premise because it just quickly turns into a different story about Lauren and Alex on the run. Suddenly, all the characters we've met disappear from the story, and then, no spoilers, but the ending is so abrupt and ridiculous that if I had had a physical copy of this book instead of my e-reader, I swear I would have chucked it across the room because I flippin' hated this book. I hated it. But if you read for atmosphere only, if you just want something creepy and weird, or maybe you have a short attention span and you prefer novellas, you may like it. I hated it. So I gave Carnalis 1 star. I gave it 1 star. I never give 1 stars. I just really didn't enjoy this one. I'm Dahlia Jane. That's Ember. The next book I read is one of only 2 books I read this month that didn't fit the Pride theme. And I made an exception because I had an advanced review copy and I'm trying to read 1 or 2 of those a month. It's Dark Messiah by debut author Sarah Z. Carson. Look at this cover with the sinister flower child with eyes that look like blood moons. I lost my mind for this cover. I was very excited about this arc. The publisher's description says this book tells the story of a teenage girl and her mother caught in the web of a sinister cult leader whose optimistic vision of hope descends into apocalyptic horror in the jungles of South America. I'm a little bit obsessed with cults. I know, it's very surprising. I see cults as my plan B if being a grown-up doesn't pan out. I haven't decided if I want to be the leader or a follower yet because I do see pros and cons for each. And I keep watching documentaries and reading about cults to try to gather enough information about them to make an informed decision. I'll let you know where I land. From the summary, which I may or may not have kept reading after caught in the web of a sinister cult leader whose optimistic vision of hope descends into apocalyptic horror, was pretty much sold on that, we learn that the book is about a 15-year-old girl who's reeling from the death of her younger sister and her parents' divorce. Vulnerable and lost, Nell and her mother find themselves pulled into the orbit of a mysterious and charismatic man known as Dad. They join his Church of the People, and before long, the love bombing that brought them in is exchanged for abuse and coercive control. When Nell is sent to Dad's utopian community deep in the jungles of South America, she has to decide what she's willing to endure to survive. Let's pause for a second. Dad, Church of the People, utopian community in South America. Does this remind you of anything? Betting at least some of you are thinking that this cult sounds a lot like Jim Jones, the People's Temple, and Jonestown. When I read the description, I did immediately pick up on the Jim Jones parallels, but I assumed that they were just a jumping off point. I thought the author was going to use that history as inspiration and then go somewhere completely unexpected in a story that stands on its own. Unfortunately, the Jim Jones stuff wasn't inspiration, it was really the whole novel. I try to avoid spoilers in these videos. I'm not sure how possible it is to spoil historic events that happened almost 50 years ago, but if you somehow know nothing about Jim Jones and you feel like you're going to want to go into this book completely blind, now is your chance to skip ahead to the next review. Just a reminder, I always timestamp these videos, so just quick scroll forward, go, because everything about the character of Dad mirrored Jim Jones. Like Dad, Jim's followers called him Father or Dad sometimes. Both of these the people in the character wore sunglasses indoors. They dyed their hair black. They wore heavy makeup. Each of them struggled with drug addiction. They adopted interracial children. They both left Indiana in disgrace for San Francisco. I mean, what are the odds they left this? It was just like, it was every detail. They both became increasingly paranoid, and eventually they moved their groups to primitive communes in South America. In the end, both Jim Jones and Dad drove their followers to a mass death event brought about by drinking cyanide. And the death toll in the real event and the fictional one were the same. It was all the same. And that's what I don't understand. The changes this novel made to the historical event were so minor to be almost nonsensical. I believe some real people close to Jim were condensed or changed, but most of the things in this book lined up with what I remember actually happened. So why change the names at all? Why call it the Church of the People instead of the People's Temple, or Concordia instead of Jonestown? Why not simply market this as a novelization of Jonestown from the perspective of a teenage girl and then commit to the history? I just don't know what they gain by barely fictionalizing it like this. And maybe there's legal issues I'm unaware of, but the events are historic and they're in the public record, so I'm just not sure what those legal issues could be. If I'd known going in that this was essentially a novelized retelling of Jonestown, I'm pretty confident I would have skipped it. Granted, I know the story of Jonestown almost inside and out, so your mileage with this story may vary. From the reviews I'm seeing, if you don't know the history, the book is riveting. But if you're gonna fictionalize one of the most infamous cult tragedies in modern history, I need a compelling reason why the story needs to be retold. You gotta give me a fresh perspective that reveals something emotional or psychological that isn't in the history books and documentaries. Or, okay, If you don't have anything new to say about Jonestown or cults in general, shine a light on a lesser-known cult whose story deserves more attention. The novel is really Nell's reflections on the experiences she had in the cult, and as far as I know, she's a fictional person. Her time in the cult wasn't all bad, but she is boring! And because of the way the novel's written, it's also obvious from the first few pages that she survives. Just like knowing the history removes the suspense, knowing that our narrator is going to make it out alive removes another layer of tension. And then to make matters worse, Nell doesn't have a lot of insight to give us. There were times in this book which she'd describe acts of deplorable cruelty, and then she'd say, I don't know why I went along with it, but I did. You don't know why you went along with it? Then why are you telling me this story? What am I supposed to learn from your experience of this moment? The other massively missed opportunity, in my opinion, was the book's treatment of race. Nell is a rich white teenage girl. By centering the story on her experiences, the novel touches on, but never went deep enough into, the racial dynamics of the cult. The real Jim Jones set himself up as some kind of white savior. His inner circle was white, but most of his followers, and the ones tasked with doing the bulk of the hard labor, they were Black. The novel hints at these dynamics, but had Nell been a person of color, or had she spoken to more people of color in the book, it could have added a greater dimension to our understanding one of the most sinister aspects of the People's Temple. I will say a couple of nice things about this book. Can be nice. I do think the abuse that Nell witnesses and endures was written with sensitivity and nuance. It didn't feel exploitative. It didn't feel like it was there for shock value. It actually seemed true to life. So that part was really well written. And I also appreciated that the novel didn't reduce her experience to something simple. It gave her space to have conflicted feelings about her time in the cult. If you're interested in Jonestown, I highly recommend The Road to Jonestown by Jeff Ginn. It's an excellent nonfiction account of what happened. And there's also a documentary that came out in 2006 called Jonestown, The Life and Death of People's Temple. And that documentary is haunting. I saw it years ago, and the final scenes have never left me. As for Dark Messiah, I'd only recommend it to you if you love historical fiction or you want to learn about Jonestown, but you just don't enjoy reading nonfiction books or watching documentaries. I gave Dark Messiah 2 stars because I didn't see the point. Oof. So after Carnalis, and Dark Messiah, I was in dangerous territory. Again, because I'd had a 1-star read followed by a 2-star read. So now I was cranky. Besides the skip the line trick, another one of my tricks is to just find a page turner that I won't want to put down. I needed a popcorn thriller, stat! I'm sure there are some excellent LGBTQIA plus popcorn thrillers out there, but this was an emergency, so I didn't have time to find one. Instead, I just scanned through my e-reader for something I'd already downloaded, and I came up with All the Lies They Told by Robin Mall. This came out in August of 2025. All the Lies They Told opens in a small town in Idaho as the sun is setting. Teenagers Lexi and Sky decide to take a shortcut home through the woods. They used to be best friends. But after a mysterious falling out between their parents, they grew apart, and now they only walk home from school together because there's safety in numbers. When they don't make it home by dinner time, though, panic begins to spread. A desperate search of the woods turns up one chilling clue: a cell phone with a cracked screen abandoned on the ground. As investigators, volunteers, and the girl's family search for them, buried secrets start to resurface. Were Lexi and Sky taken by someone their parents hurt? Could one of the parents be involved? What unspeakable thing happened to fracture their bonds in the first place? Meanwhile, Lexi and Sky find themselves trapped in a nightmare, forced to rely on each other in ways neither of them ever imagined. As hope fades for everyone, the girls realize that if they're going to survive, they'll have to fight for each other. This book was exactly what the doctor ordered to get me out of my reading slump. I wanted a page turner, and that's what I got. I finished it in one afternoon because it has fast-paced, short chapters with lots of cliffhangers, reveals. It keeps moving along. That said, while it's a fun read, it's not a great read. If you've read a lot of thrillers, I suspect you'll guess where this one is going. And I don't want to give anything away, but the book ends with one of my least favorite plot twists, and I did roll my eyes. However, what kept me so engaged throughout was the way Lexi and Skye were written, because so often in thrillers, female characters in peril are passive, but these girls were not. They quickly put aside their differences, they made plans, they looked for opportunities to escape, and they fought their hearts out. So I was rooting for them the whole time, and I was moved by their strength. I found myself asking, could I do what they did if I was in their chains? I hope I never need to find out. But besides the unsatisfying ending, my other problem with this book was their parents. This is mostly a domestic drama thriller where everybody's lying and keeping secrets, and I understand that the parents' bad behavior goes a long way in fueling the tension. But there were so many times that I struggled to believe that these people that were facing one of the worst situations imaginable couldn't bury the hatchet for 2 minutes. They just kept turning on each other, and while their daughters were being total badasses, they were behaving like a bunch of impulsive teenagers. So I flew through this one, and I was definitely engaged. But as soon as I closed it, I thought, yeah, okay, fun, but not great. Readable, but not totally believable. So I gave All the Lies They Told 3 stars. Throughout the month, I also read 2 nonfiction books about LGBTQIA+ horror. The first was Uncanny Valley Girls by Zephyr Lisowski. Released in 2005, Uncanny Valley Girls is part memoir and part horror film criticism. Through a series of personal essays, Lisowski explores her lifetime relationship with horror movies and how they helped her process chronic illness, institutionalization, grief, trans identity, queer love, and survival. Each essay pairs her personal experiences with close readings of horror films like The Ring, Scream, and Black Swan. The writing is absolutely gorgeous. I highlighted so many passages. One quote I especially loved says that horror movies showed me the possibility of a place filled with beauty and pain in equal measure. They showed me how to identify a hurt before I even knew how to name my own. That's a really interesting way to think about horror, because it's not just about scaring people. It can deepen our understanding of ourselves. It can touch on emotional truths in so many ways. And then later she writes, quote, "It's not that I was incurable, but rather the idea of a cure was proposed by someone who hated my existence in the first place. Slowly, I built a community out of a life, and in that way, I began to heal." The author's meditations on mental and physical health really resonated with me. There's a lot of power in questioning what health looks like, who defines that for us, and why. Even though I love horror, my favorite essay in the collection, it actually wasn't even about a horror movie at all. It was one of the final essays, and it was about trans doll artist Greer Langton. I wasn't familiar with her work before reading this, but the essay was really provocative. The only thing I had a little trouble with in this book is that because the essays are not linear, it's memoir, but it's not, it intentionally moves through memories. There were times when I felt disoriented. I had trouble following where the author was taking me. But just overall, I found this collection incredibly moving and thought-provoking. And one line near the end of the book says, quote, "Horror, after all, is foremost an exercise in feeling things." Reading this book, I felt a lot. Unfortunately, though, I had a much more mixed experience with my next nonfiction read, which was titled It Came from the Closet, Queer Reflections on Horror. This is a 2022 essay collection, and it features 25 different LGBTQIA+ writers. Like Uncanny Valley Girls, this book combines horror film criticism with personal memoir, but instead of one author's perspective, each essay explores how a different queer writer has been served, harmed, or in some cases served and harmed by horror. There were several essays I loved. S. Trimble's essay on The Exorcist and Tucker Lieberman's essay on A Nightmare on Elm Street, both really good. But my favorite was Will Stockton's essay connecting the Child's Play films with his experience being a gay foster father to a troubled teenage son. That one was intense. But with 25 contributors, the collection was inevitably a little uneven. Some essays were so short that they never fully developed their ideas, and there were a few I just didn't connect to at all. I still think this is a worthwhile collection if you enjoy horror criticism or queer film studies. I'm sure there's something in here that would resonate with you. But I found it hit or miss, so I gave it 3 stars. The next book I read was Bone of My Bone by Joanna Van Veen. This is a new release. It just came out at the end of May. Against the backdrop of the horrors of the 30 Years' War in 1635, a Protestant peasant named Elsbeth saves Sister Ursula from being brutally assaulted. Devastation has swept the land, and neither of them has a safe home to return to. So together they form an uneasy alliance, and they set off through the forest in search of safety. But before long, they stumble across a dying man holding a gilded relic. According to legend, the saint's skull he carries has the power to grant a wish to any who reunite it with its body. And these 2 women, they've lost everything, so they just have no problem thinking of wishes that would ease their suffering. But even though Elsbeth doesn't believe in saints or their magic, she can't help feeling intrigued, so they immediately agree to embark on this quest to accomplish the task. Unfortunately, they're not the only ones with plans for the skull. A sinister necromancer is hunting the relic as well, turning their desperate journey through a war-torn landscape into something even more perilous. Said I was obsessed with cults, and I am, but I'm also obsessed with relics and the stories about them. I was really excited for this book. It's a fun read. The author brings a lot of German folklore and medieval superstition into it. I was always curious to see what would appear next. Plus, the quest itself kept me turning the pages, and I stayed invested in the fate of the skull throughout. But I was less invested in the fates of the human characters. They were passably likable, they were reasonably well developed. I didn't put the book down wishing I could spend any more time with them. As with all of Joanna Van Veen, sorry if I'm saying that wrong, there's a queer romance element in this book, just like in all her books. And the book gets spicy. But the spice in this was child's play compared to Feast While You Can. My biggest problem is that the journey from wary companions to friends to more than friends happens extremely quickly. Granted, these characters didn't know if any given day would be their last, so they were probably trauma bonding, but I think a little more time to let the tension between them breathe would have made the spice and the ending of this book feel a lot more earned, at least for me. At least I would have felt that way. I do feel I should warn you that the horrors of war and the savagery of desperate men are recounted in graphic detail throughout the book. The author does not hold back. I don't know how many rotting and bloated corpses we meet. It gets gruesome. So if that's more than you think you could handle, just be aware of that going in. If you're already a fan of this author's work, you really like her writing style, you'll probably like this book too. Or if you like books that mix dark historical fiction, fantasy, and folklore and move through the plot quickly, I think you'll have a good time with it. I thought it was okay. It was fun. I'm probably not going to be thinking about it in a few months, so I gave Bone of My Bone 3 stars. From Bone of My Bone's necromancy, I jumped into another book filled to the brim with dark magic called Muneca by Cynthia Gomez. In Muneca, we meet Maddie, a Latina working-class orphan who's grieving the recent loss of her beloved mother and wrestling with the idea of picking up her grandmother's magical practice again. Her grandmother's a dark witch who brought nothing but trouble to the family. But Maddie thinks she could use magic for good. It's worth a try. When she learns that a wealthy Spanish heiress who she knew as a girl has become paralyzed by some kind of inexplicable illness, Maddie suspects this woman's been hexed. And hoping for a rich financial reward, she talks her way back onto the estate and becomes her companion. Maddie reaches the paralyzed woman in a way no one expected and begins the work of rescuing this helpless muñeca, which is Spanish for doll. I hope I'm not butchering it, but I might be. She rescues this doll from the evil forces that have trapped her. This book packed a big punch in only 171 pages. After the Carnalis fiasco, Carnalis, I don't know how to say that either. Okay. After the Carnalis fiasco this month, that was the novella I read that I thought needed to be thrown across the room. And then also, some of you might remember Psychopomp and Circumstance back in March. Those are the 2 novellas I read this year. I read 2 novellas. I hated both of them. So at that point, after the second one, I'm like, that's it. No more novellas. I'm swearing off novellas. But The library app I use, it doesn't show page numbers, so I really didn't know that this one was so short, and that's probably a good thing because I'm sure I would have skipped it, and then I would have missed out on all the witchy fun. This is a delightful gothic sapphic story. I would say it's horror light, but it does have all the ingredients of a satisfying gothic tale. It has the once grand estate that's slowly decaying, sinister family secrets, betrayal, foreboding relatives, and an atmosphere dripping with dread. But it's also a refreshingly modern take in the way that it weaves in themes of class, racism, feminism, and even consent. And then beneath all of it is a sweet romance between two women who just want the freedom to be themselves and choose who they love. One of my favorite characters was, you guessed it, Maddie's grandmother. I love every scene that's set in her house because she just gave great villain energy, and I would happily read a story that was just about her in the future. And I think this one would be a fantastic October read because it's so atmospheric and spooky. But even though it's one of the best novellas I've ever read, it just wasn't long enough for me to get immersed in the world or the characters, enough that I would make this a 5-star read. So I gave Muneca 4 stars. It was my favorite fiction of the month though, and I definitely recommend it if you like gothic love stories. The final book I read was Pearl, The Obsessions and Passions of Janis Joplin by Ellis Amber. You might not think that this fits the LGBTQIA+ theme, but did you know Janis Joplin was actually bisexual? This book was originally published in 1992, which is 22 years after Janis died. And it's the 3rd biography I've read about her in just 2 months. The 2 I read last month were good, but neither of them felt like they exhausted the subject, so I was looking for something else. Of these 3 books, I would say that Pearl romanticizes Janis the least. It does not paint a rosy picture of her as a human being or a rock star. Instead, it focuses on how her losing battle with addictions destroyed her life long before she died of an overdose. It says that Janis sabotaged all of her relationships, even as she seemed to be desperately chasing love. She was in great pain, and she self-medicated that not only through alcohol and drugs, but sex as well. I was not prepared for how much this biography got into Janis's sex life. The other 2 biographies I read were written by women, and this one was written by a man, so I did find myself wondering if that's why it seemed so preoccupied with her sexuality. But all 3 books did show that she had a great appetite for experiencing life. And it's pretty clear to me that she also loved being the center of attention. So I don't know, but I don't think she'd mind having details about her sex life shared as long as people were just talking about her. I just wasn't expecting it. The book discusses a lot of her conquests, including rock legends Jim Morrison and Jimi Hendrix, her girlfriends, and even teenage boys she pulled off the street. Janis seemed to have a bottomless need for connection and attention and a hatred for being alone with her thoughts. This book gives a lot more attention to her relationships than it does to her music. If you're looking to dive into Janis's creative process or her recordings, then I would give this a pass because it's mainly about her turbulent personal life. One of the most poignant parts was hearing from people who actually knew Janis because Amber interviewed many of them, and even decades after her death, it was clear they still carried both deep affection for her and these scars of having loved someone who was just so self-destructive. Of the 3 Janis biographies I've read in just 2 months, I would say that Janis, Her Life and Music by Holly George Warren, gives the best timeline. If you're more interested in her psychology, Buried Alive by Myra Friedman paints a more balanced and intimate portrait of her. And then finally, Pearl by Ellis Amber probably gives the most realistic look into the devastation of her addictions. This book is unflinching and bleak. I am glad I read it. It did show another side of Janis. I just thought it could have been more balanced overall, but I did give it 4 stars. And now I think I'm done reading Janis Joplin biographies for the time being. We'll see, but I think it's going to do it. And that wraps up my June reading recap. In total, I finished 9 books, and my average rating was 3 stars, which is just okay. Unfortunately, there was nothing I want to shout about from the rooftops, but some months are just like that. I would love to hear from you, though. What was your last 5-star read? Have you read any of the books I talked about, or do you plan to? If you did make it to the end of this video and you feel like saying hi, leave me a little skull emoji. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of my future videos. Thank you so much for watching. Be well and be witchcrafting.